Mario, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to share a class with students on future studies. I think it's such an interesting topic. I had never the opportunity of taking a class like this one. So I'm very excited to share my work with you and see where we can find synergies and commonalities. And well, looking forward for your questions and insights as well. Let me share my screen. And please let me know if you are already seeing it. It's there, right?
Yeah, it is there.
Okay, great, cool. So this is the name of the project I work in. It's called Future of Work in the Global South, and it's most of what I'm going to try to cover today. It's just an overview. As Mario mentioned, I'm working in an independent think tank. I'm going to say the full name just once because it's pretty long, but CIPPEC stands for Center for the Implementation for Public Policy for Equity and Growth. So yeah, you don't need to learn that. It took me a while to learn it myself. But within this institution, I am part of the economic development program, but specifically I'm working on the topic of the future of work. And specifically there is a project that also looks at an even more specific part of the future of work, which is the Global South. And we have realized and we are working on explaining why the Global South cannot just adopt the global view of the future of work because it has its own needs, and that has implications for policy that we need to be aware of. So that's what today's presentation is going to be about. This is a roadmap for today. We're going to start in part one by doing a quick introduction about where this all starts. We're going to talk a little bit about technology, how this might be a window of opportunity for developing countries and for the Global South. Then we're going to link this to the world of work. What are the impacts or the effects that technology is already having and is expected to have for workers? But we're going to start by looking at it from a global perspective, the standard narrative on the future of work. And then in the third part and the last one, we are going to see what this very broad perspective is missing from the future of work from a Global South perspective, okay? Then we are going to try to save some time for questions, but also maybe we can address specific questions after each of the parts conclude, after part one, after part two. Feel free to raise your hands or leave your questions in the chat box, just the usual dynamics that you do in this class, okay? So to get started, part one, and technology as an opportunity window. So yet again, we are undergoing another industrial revolution. It's not the first one. You probably already seen this or are aware of this, but let's just make a quick recap. This started a long time ago in England as at the epicenter, the first industrial revolution. It was fueled by the steam power as its main technology and innovation. And then this was followed not so long after that in the second industrial revolution, which mainly took place in the US. And this was based on electricity, a general purpose technology that was pervasive, as we all are very aware, and which gave rise to the mass production system, to the assembly line, and what we know as the Fordism model that was so important in the 20th century. And then, according to some people in the 70s, according to some people a little bit later, the third industrial revolution started. This was based on the first levels of automation, on information and communication technologies. And yes, this was the first instances where computers started to play an important role. And now, based on this one, we are undergoing the fourth industrial revolution. This one is basically based on fusion of technologies that are starting to blur the lines between the physical, the digital, and biological dimensions of everything we do, basically because the digital aspect has started to be able to affect or influence the rest of the spheres. And now, for example, we can add value and create goods and services that are measured in bits rather than atoms for the very first time. So if it's difficult to put or to establish how all of this started, because obviously it's a confluence of factors that reinforce each other. But if I had to start to tell the story, I would start with digitization, right? Digitization is transforming an analog piece of information into a digital piece of information. And it may be just, you know, having a customer's information in paper and data entry into the computer, and then it's digitalized. But of course, the process that we are seeing, and it started already a decade ago, more or less, or even before, it's not about data entering information, right? It's about the amount of information that we as users and consumers started generating ourselves. Think about, for example, our use of the digital world through our cell phones, every tap we make, every click we make in our laptops, every like in social media, every video on Netflix, absolutely everything. Even when we are doing nothing, even when we are going for a walk, if we have our phone with GPS activated, we are generating data as well. So it's very pervasive, it's everywhere, and it's massive amounts. And that's only our perspective as users of, for example, of cell phones or laptops. But then we also have to mirror that into the world of production and into the private sector, into the factories, into the government. Each of the social actors are becoming data generators and data users, very prolific data generators. And for example, if we think that in the last 2 years, we have generated more data than ever before in the history of humanity. That just blows my mind. And not because I think that, I don't know, in the early 20th century, I wouldn't expect us to be generating much data, but the fact that in 2 years, we are already generating more than 3 years ago or 4 years ago, when we were already in the middle of this process, just shows that there's still so much left to be digitized, and that this process is only starting at some point and is expected to keep growing. So data, of course, data generation is a necessary condition for this to become a wider phenomenon, but there's also a confluence of factors, including the ability to process all this data, increasing computing capacity, and the ability to store more and more data in less and less space. So all of that has been happening, and then an ecosystem of data arise, and this gives rise to the big data phenomenon, which does not only require data to exist and to be able to be stored, but also shows the fact that this data can be potentially useful and can provide many insights that before would not be available. And the discipline that deals with making sense of this data is data science. So that's the data ecosystem that we are seeing today. And based on that, or related to that, a whole wide range of technologies appeared and are developing. At the very center of this is artificial intelligence, the star technology probably of this fourth industrial revolution, but plenty of technologies that are disrupting the way we consume and reproduce, such as augmented reality, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, automatization, robotics, and so on. Let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and why it's so important. Basically, artificial intelligence allows to transform simple data into decisions that used to be left for humans only. And these can already be taken in complex settings. So artificial intelligence, it has advanced so much and can do so much, but at the same time, it can't still replicate human behavior, right? Its capacities are limited to very specific and defined domains. Most of the advances are in what we call narrow artificial intelligence, and general artificial intelligence is still a utopia. It's not near of happening yet. And every artificial intelligence system basically has these three components that we are seeing on the left. So data obviously is a key factor. It's needed for setting up a system of artificial intelligence. It's needed for training it. And there's also a continuous feedback loop that needs to take place for it to work. Then there's technology. And here's where what to do with this data, explanations, instructions, or algorithms take place. This is where machine learning has a big role. Machine learning has become very, very good at pattern recognition and at predicting outcomes. So it's an important part of an artificial intelligence system. And then last but not least, people play a key role as well. People are the ones who will define the questions that a specific artificial intelligence system can answer. It will define the scope for which this artificial intelligence system is capable of providing good performance. And it's also going to be behind parts of the training of, for example, the algorithms, provoking, as you may have heard in some cases, some biases. So people are still important even in an artificial intelligence or data-driven world. Now, let's talk about artificial intelligence in the different economic sectors. What is the impact of artificial intelligence? On the one hand, on the left, we can see that it has huge impacts to develop or generate growth like in the tech sector, right? This is the supply side of technology, which is growing drastically because of artificial intelligence-based solutions. So obviously, or the typical examples would be software development, business, data analytics services, digital marketing services. All of these are services that technology firms are now providing more and more widely. And it's not random that the biggest firms today, based on their market caps, are all technology firms. They are not car makers anymore. It's Apple, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft, it's Google, and it's Facebook. And that's one side of the story. That's one of the reasons there's such a big potential for growth based on technology. It is because it allows for the growth of the technology producing sector. But the thing with artificial intelligence is that it has the potential to be a general purpose technology, which means that it has the potential to improve the production services, the production processes of many other sectors, and it has spillover effects. That means that when it's applied in one sector, the opportunities for other sectors to apply it increase as well. We create know-how, we create opportunities for other implementations too. So for example, if we look at the demand side of technology, this would be instances, sectors or opportunities where these different actors demand these technologies based on artificial intelligence or associated ones. So for example, customer service, we've all had to deal with chat boxes, for example. Many enterprises are trying to replace human interaction, and I don't think that's still working very well. At least I have experienced many frustrations with this. But the truth is that via techniques such as natural language processing and so on. These devices are getting better and better and are starting to get more and more used and will probably keep improving. There's also a lot of potential in logistics. Think, for example, in the truck business, where before there used to be a broker between the truck driver and the businesses who wanted their products distributed. And there were a lot of different, not necessarily manual, but a lot of different ways where this broker tried for the trucker not to drive empty, or at least do it at least as possible. And now artificial intelligence has already solved much of that, or is improving it. The same goes with warehouses, where the space needs to be optimized and artificial intelligence can help in that. Factories are already applying smart sensors in their machinery so that they can measure very in much detail what they produce and optimize their production processes to details that were not possible before. There are applications in agriculture, such as, for example, using satellite images to, for example, calculate risks for crops and plantings in general. And more cross-topic, there is the marketing issue, and we live that as consumers, how now our preferences as consumers can be targeted so specifically that it has changed the way all sectors publicize their goods and how they reach their potential customers. So these are plenty of opportunities brought by technology in the economy. And here we're going to see a little bit of the potential that this brings for growth in the economy. What basically happens is that when firms, so many firms at the same time optimize or are working to optimize or improve their production processes, they increase their productivity. So that means that with the same number of workers that they employ, they can produce a larger number of goods and services. And usually this is accompanied by increases in wages because of increases in productivity. And in a nutshell, it's a positive supply shock. So more goods come into the economy and are produced. This also means that prices fall usually. So competitiveness and capacity of exports is gained by these firms who innovate. And also from the side of the consumer, they are allowed to buy more goods or demand more goods, not necessarily of the good which price has been reduced because of excess demand, but they just have more money to spend it elsewhere as well. So this usually starts a virtuous circle of growth. And it has also spillover effects, because by innovating or becoming innovative in economy, human capital growth, know-how gets extended, and the general purpose technologies gets more and more used. So the point that I wanted to make is that technology brings a big opportunity for growth, and this is particularly important for developing countries such as those in the Global South. Here we can see how the performance of innovation leaders in the previous industrial revolution has played out. These are the countries that took the lead in the previous industrial revolutions, and they all skyrocketed their GDP per capita. That's what we are seeing. So the UK in the first industrial revolution, then we have the US in the second industrial revolution. Here the increase it's exponential, it's much greater, it's fourfold. And the third industrial revolution, we're portraying it with China's performance, which is just incredible if you consider the starting point of less than $2,000 per capita in the 90s. So this is why we think that there is really an opportunity here brought by technology, and in the Global South, we want to take advantage of it, and that's what we're working on. This is the end of part one, so let's just take one moment to recap. So technology and the fourth industrial revolution as a window of opportunity. We saw how we are undergoing the fourth industrial revolution. We saw how there is this potential for artificial intelligence to improve production. And we think that this is a window opportunity for growth and for development. Now let's move on to part 2 to talk about the impact that technology and what we just discussed will potentially have on the world for work. Are there any questions, or shall we move on and leave the questions to the end? I will make an awkward silence in case anyone wants to speak.
Sorry, if anyone wants to ask, you can raise your hands and you have the chance to ask.
Okay, no problem. Let's move on, but still feel free to raise hands or just leave a comment in the chat box if you have any questions, so you don't forget. So part 2 is about the link between technology and the labor markets. We can't avoid talking about robots here. This is because science fiction, and you guys probably know about this better than me because you are studying futures, but science fiction has had a huge role on how we think about the future. And this is also the case for how we think about the future of work. There is this general idea that robots will just surpass humans' abilities to do basically everything. Plus they don't get sick, plus they don't need much. So there is this idea that's also being portrayed in some movies and so on, that in the future, workers will be robots. And this has generated genuine fears and anxieties about a jobless future. And I think that that idea is still pretty widespread. The word robot, this is interesting, was introduced by Karel Čapek in the 1920s. He was a chess author, and he introduced the term in a play. And the original chess word robota means forced labor. And in that play, the robots, they were not metallic or mechanical beings or things. They were sort of fake humans who had to do all the boring or the dullest tasks at work. So basically, Čapek was trying to complain about how dehumanized the labor or the tasks for a worker had become in the 20th century. And I guess this makes me ask myself if he was right, if we have been robots a little bit for at least for some jobs. And if now that robots seem to be becoming a reality and come maybe to replace us in these dull tasks, if we might be missing that dynamics that in the earliest 20th century Čapek was so annoyed about. And also this makes me wonder if robots are actually an opportunity to start to become humans again in the way we work. These are just open questions and reflections, but let's leave aside the science fiction because it's not all we have. There's also some evidence-based trends. The scientific approach on the future of work is to think about which are the channels through which these technological advances could impact on jobs. And what the researchers and scholars are seeing is that it's true, there are some trends that could be characterized as job destructing, because it's true that there is a potential to automate certain tasks currently performed by human. But But these are very specific tasks, right? These are concentrated on on tasks, not on entire jobs, but on tasks within jobs that are considered to be highly routine or highly routinized. That is very repetitive. That's where robots are actually better than humans. So that is true, that might threaten certain jobs that are high in routinary tasks. But on the other hand, there also is a potential for job creation. And this is via the productivity and the growth dynamics that we've described before, that are what characterizes a growth cycle produced by, for example, a technological revolution like the one that is happening. And this means that the jobs that are complemented or that are augmented by technology are probably going to get more demanded. And besides that, there's going to appear, or it's expected that it's going to appear, that a lot of new jobs that currently don't exist are going to appear. So these are two opposite trends. And what does science has to say about this? What they do is they rely on a third factor, which is historical evidence. The logic is that if history is any guide, we should expect that institutions, for example, education institutions, labor market institutions, adapt to the new situation so that they, for example, prepare workers for the new demands in the labor market, and that the positive trends, the job creation trends, overcomes the negative, the job destruction trends. What does this mean, institutional adaptation? What it means is that, for example, education systems. The education systems that we know that are still the norm around the world, they, back in the day, were an institutional adaptation to the new needs of the time of the first industrial revolution. The model of education that we see today, the premise is that we just need a fixed set of skills. They can all be taught in classroom. We all need the same ones. But there's also implicitly the need to convey skills that are beyond the content and the curricula, such as the fact that you need to be in the same place every day, the fact that you need to be punctual, the fact that you need to have fixed schedules. So the current education system was an institutional innovation back then. And now innovating in the education system would mean to adapt, for example, the curricula to the new requirements of the labor markets. And what the scientific view thinks is that this is going to happen, that skill mismatches that we are presently seeing due to technological change can be addressed via the education system. In the case of labor market institutions, we can think, for example, about the digital platform-based jobs, ranging from ride-hailing and delivery to freelancers and micro-work, the gig economy in general, and how these, I'm sorry, I got distracted by something else. But what we're seeing in the institution, in the labor market platforms at the moment, is that there seems to be like an unending discussion on whether people who work in these platforms are independent workers or whether they are employees from these companies such as Uber. And what it seems to be happening is that the institutions, the labor market institutions that used to be enough to contemplate every possible situation are just becoming obsolete. And we need to update and innovate in those labor institutions to allow for these new forms of work. And again, the researchers suggest that this innovation might take some time. So the technology might generate and is generating some short-term frictions, but that eventually they will be overcome. So, to summarize, the global narrative of work on the future of work that takes into consideration these three factors that we've just seen, it says something like this about the future of work. So new job opportunities, particularly in the set of tasks that complement and augment the power of technology, will continue to be created. At the same time, jobs involving tasks prone to become obsolete due to the adoption of technology will continue to be threatened. Frictions, including skills mismatch and income inequality, will arise in the short term. So these are the frictions that we were talking about. But if history is any guide, these frictions are transitory and societies will manage to solve them, enabling for long-term equilibrium where both the number of jobs and wages increase. So basically, the general and widespread view is quite optimistic. There are going to be difficulties in the short term, but we can address them, and there's not going to be a jobless future. The challenge then, in a nutshell, is to repeat history. We need to ensure that we do again what we've done in the past, in previous industrial revolutions. I'm leaving here a few reports that you can look at to see how these narratives conveyed, for example, by the World Economic Forum or the IMF, so you can check those out afterwards. The thing is, and this is the reason that we are working on a specific view for the Global South, that the Global South has not done so well in the past. There are many countries, developed and advanced economies, that have done great in previous industrial revolutions. But let's take a look at the graphs that we saw a while ago with the innovation leader in the previous industrial revolutions and compare that with how the Global South regions have done in the past. So here's the first industrial revolution. So you can see how while the UK was skyrocketing, the Global South regions were just not. We are looking at Latin America, the Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Second industrial revolution, well, we can see kind of an upward slope in the 1950s and so on, but the gaps increased giantly. It's just not comparable, the level of growth. Again, we are looking at the per capita GDP here. And the third industrial revolution, this is a Chinese miracle. China basically starts from below all the regions in the 1990s. And there is a projection there because it ends in 2025, but it's expected to, and has already surpassed all the Global South regions. So that's a problem if we just copy this narrative, because we can't afford to repeat history in the Global South. So to recap what we saw in this part 2, we talked about the link between technology and work and how technology can impact the world of work in the future. But we took a global perspective, the general view. We saw that there are some anxieties, mostly based on science fiction. We saw that if we look at researchers' evidence and historical based evidence, there is a sort of optimism about how the future work will play out. But we also can start to see that we need a special or specific view to address the Global South situation. So next we are going to talk about the Global South. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have one. Do you think the development of the parts or like of the countries in our world will continue like this? So the ones which are already developed will be always above the ones which are not. So they basically can't even get to the level where, for example, the US or China are right now. Or do you think they have a chance of getting to levels where they are right now?
Well, I think the Chinese example is an example that it can be done. I think there is an opportunity, but at the same time, it requires so much emphasis on the plan and so much credibility on the plans and so much consensus. I think consensus within societies at the moment is one of the hardest things to obtain. There are so many different interests, and fortunately societies are democratic, but that also makes it more difficult to agree on things. That I think that maybe China has used its authoritarian model in favor to not have to discuss what they wanted to do with anyone, because the government just, is able to act. So I think we need to find a way to make it work as China did, but for democracy's models. But yes, I think it can be done. I am optimistic that it can be done, but I know that it needs a change of mindset. If we project the present into the future, it's not going to happen. So in that sense, I'm pessimistic. We need some change.
Yeah. And do you think the ones which are already do you think that China also can go the way down again, like they did a few years or the recent years on their way up? Do you think it's possible that they can just crash through, I don't know, financial systems which break down, whatever? Because I think China has huge amounts of debt and stuff. And if they can't pay that back, they will struggle definitely.
I think that's a possibility for absolutely every country in every level of development. Countries can crash, that can happen. But I don't think that China is more prone to that, because most of the countries are highly indebted. They have high levels of debt. And all that matters in debt most of the time is credibility. You need to be able to convey that you are a trustworthy debtor and that you will pay your debt. So I think that even when a country crashes, but if it comes from a point of development, no one can take away from a country that crashes what the know-how, the human capital, the physical capital, the technology that they already have. So I wouldn't expect that to happen to China, but I admit there is a risk of that happening to any country at any point in time.
All right, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Any other questions right now? Let's then move forward to part 3, which is the future work from the Global South perspective. Okay, so we have seen the global narrative on the future work. And the thing with narratives is that they're simplified accounts of facts. And that means that they don't have much detail, and they might seem a little bit shallow, but they are very useful because they allow policies to be framed on a vision. They are useful for future thinking as well, I think. And they also allow for the general public to connect and engage in discussions that otherwise would be either too technical or too difficult to grasp or too sparse for them to be able to discuss it or to address them or to find the time to make sense of all that information. So the narrative that we just saw about future work and how it will play out in a good way, it's useful. But the thing is that by being simple, it just still needs to get the diagnostics right. Otherwise, the medicine, or in this case, the policy implications, are not going to help, and we can't afford that when we are talking about development. So what we are proposing here is that although, and as helpful as that narrative is to, for example, overcome the fears and the anxieties generated by this fear of a jobless and filled by robots future, We think it's time to add diversity and keep developing this narrative to add the complexity, in this case, of the developing countries. So what we've done is we've identified 5 key topics that are related to the future of work, that have an impact on the policies needed for the future of work, but where the Global South differs from the Global North. So these are sort of the building blocks for a new narrative on the future of work that also includes the Global South. So the first one of these key points is about how technology or how technological change is taking place. Let's take a look at the drawing is pretty clear. In the left, you can see a representation of the Global North, to put it some way, and on the right, you can see a representation of the Global South. But the point that they are trying to make is that innovation and technological change at exponential rates, it's already happening in the developed world. And the developed world is trying to deal with this and finding ways, for example, to update the skills and address the skills mismatches because technology is already there. And the thing is that in the Global South, we can't borrow these stylized facts. We just cannot take it for granted, because what is happening when we look at the data is that in the Global North, there is this phenomena that is observed by the scholars that's called a hollowing out effect. That is where middle-skilled workers get less job opportunities and start being paid less. Why middle-skilled workers? This is because the routinary tasks, the highly routine tasks that we mentioned before, that are more automatable, that are more subject to be replaced with technology, are usually concentrated on middle skills workers. And this may seem paradoxical because one would expect low-skilled workers to be most affected. But the thing is that low-skilled work, most of the time, or many times, requires manual work. And sometimes this manual work needs to be high-precision manual work. And robots and technology, they have not been able to replicate that yet. Robots are too clumsy, or they still can't manage diversity of objects to handle. So in the Global North, there is already this hollowing out effect occurring, and the most plausible hypothesis is that this is because of technological change happening, of automation already happening. But when we look at the Global South, what we see is that, in theory, if we look at the technological feasibility of automating jobs, we should be at higher risk because we have more of these routine-based jobs. Not only we have more of these routine-based jobs, but if you compare the same occupations in developed countries against in developing countries, the same occupation, for example, being a doctor, to give an example, it's carried out differently. Perhaps that's not a good example, but some occupations are conducted differently. And in the Global South, there are, in the same occupations, more routine-based tasks. That probably has to do with the stage of development of the country. But considering all of that, we should be expected to be at higher risk of automation in the Global South. And if you read the literature on automation, you will find a lot of alerts about that, like be careful because you will lose a lot of jobs in the Global South to automation. But that's just technological feasibility. When we look at what is actually happening, if this technological feasibility is manifesting itself, it's not. The possibility is there, but the fact that it's possible technologically to replace certain jobs and to add robots to do those tasks does not mean that it's economically convenient. And this is because in the Global South, there are plenty of factors that inhibit investment in technology that have to do with macroeconomic conditions, institutional conditions, labor is cheaper, so the incentives to automate are different. And we're going to see this in the next points. Demography is different as well. So the point is, we cannot borrow the narrative from the global north because we cannot take technological change for granted. We need to make it happen. We need to promote it. The good part about this is that we have more time to get ready for a potential scenario where a lot of jobs are lost to automation. Technological change is good, but losing jobs, if people cannot transition to another job, it's a very, very catastrophic scenario. So the fact that it's not happening yet gives us time to prepare. The bad thing is that we might be further away from this window of opportunity for growth than we want to be. So we really need to do something to take advantage of technology. So I made it a little bit long, but this is the first point where the global south differs from the global north. Let's move forwards to the second point. This has to do with demography. Let's take a look at the drawing. What we can see here is that in the left, this is a representation of the global north. Robots are more welcome, to put it some way, because societies are aging and labor forces are becoming less crowded, less people. There is less people in the age for work, and this means that the incentives to include robots in the production process might be higher because also the costs for labor are higher. Excuse me. I'm not used to speaking so much. And if we take a look at the right part of the drawing, this is the global south, we can see that there are masses and masses of people that need a job. And this piece of data blew my mind a few days ago. We were preparing a report, and the forecasts for population, for working age population in the global north for the next decade is of an additional 5 million workers. That's in the global north. In the global south, it's almost 300 million. So 5 million against 300 million, it's hardly impossible to compare, right? So so demography definitely has an effect on all of this. And again, in terms of technology, it means that incentives to automate are higher in the global north than in the global south. That's the second point where the global south differs from the global north. Let's go to the third one. Sorry. Skills. Skills is a big topic in the literature of the future of work, of course. Let's take again a look at the drawing. In the left, this is a little bit exaggerated, I think, but pupils are already learning about coding, they have their laptops, and they are already updating the curricular contents of what they are teaching, or at least they are discussing how to update curricular contents, because obviously with the fourth industrial revolution, there's a new need for new skills. The skills that are mostly demanded are, of course, digital skills, technical skills, but not only that, also soft skills are becoming more important, and skills such as creativity, such as the ability to deal with diverse situations, flexibility, and so on are the skills of the future. So in the global north, the drawing shows that these discussions are already taking place. While in the global south, although there have been huge improvements in schooling, the quality of learning is just not as good. If you look at the piece at the text there in the middle, you can see that if you look at the quality assessment evaluations from the OECD, in the global north, in the primary school, almost 100% of students can solve or can pass a minimum proficiency threshold in math. And in Latin America, for example, it's half of that. So the thing with skills is that we need to update the curricula in this global south as well, but it's not enough. We need to improve structurally our education systems if we want to solve the potential skills mismatch and if we want to get ready for the fourth industrial revolution. 1 second for water again, sorry. And the next one, the fourth issue, where the global south and the global north are different, has to do with starting point, in terms of labor market institutions. The drawing is basically referred to platforms, jobs in platforms, digital platforms, again. And on the left, we can see a worker from the global north that before the platforms or the technology high scales appear, perhaps she worked in an office or something and she was complaining about not having so much time at home and so on. With technology means that, for example, platforms have appeared. And this is sort of it levels down and in the case of the global north and up in the case of the global south workers, because a platform worker competes against the whole globe. So in the middle scenario, we have the global south north worker and the global south workers being freelancers, perhaps still facing different issues. Perhaps still the global south worker is facing a harder context to deal with. But if we look at the right side of the drawing, the previous situation for the global south worker might have been a situation of informality, of not having social insurance, not having any kind of, basically informality, which means that the worker is practically invisible. The government cannot reach these workers with policy. And considering that, although platform work has a lot of problems and minimum standards for work need to be achieved, both in the global north and in the global south, for global south, this might be an opportunity to start addressing issues related to informality. And that might be a good thing. Again, this is the fourth point where the global south and the global north are different. And the last point of difference that we've identified has got to do with inequality. In the left side of the drawing, we have the global north, and there is sort of a race between a robot and a worker, and the robot seems to be winning this race because it's faster or so. But in the long term, according to the phrase right there, people get training, the skills mismatch is solved, and this worker might get a job in the technology sector where her skills are complemented or augmented by technology. So this race between technology and workers is just short term in many cases. And while in this short-term period where the workers don't have the necessary skills, there might be a short-term income-based inequality because those workers who already have the skills get more demanded and get paid better. Eventually, the others can catch up. So basically, the problem in the global north seems to be more of an inequality of short term and only based on income, which can be solved. In the Global South, the situation is different. Well, you can see that the robot is also winning the race there. There's one worker that is about to catch up, but the rest of the workers, they are far, far behind, and their possibilities of catching up are just minimal. So the thing with inequality in the Global South is that it's structural. It's very embedded in many dimensions of society. And this may make it very difficult for technology to, to enter into a society in a systematic and generalized way. So inequality may be preventing exponential technological change to take place in the Global South. That is the last point that we've identified where the Global South and Global North differ. Let me walk you through the implications very quickly so that we have some time for questions. These are the 5 issues that we've just discussed: technological change, demography, skills, labor market institutions, and inequality. What does it mean for the Global South that technological change is not taking place so far in a generalized manner? It means that it needs to be actively promoted. It means that macroeconomics needs to be stabilized in many countries, and institutions need to be appropriate for doing business as well, so that long-term investments are incentivized. It also means that we need to work on AI plans and Industry 4.0 plans. There are plenty of examples that we could base ourselves on, but we need to adapt them to our situations. We need these plans to be credible, and we need to adapt them as well. Technology and technological change promotion need to go hand in hand with skills, because there is no way that we are going to manage to host a technological transformation if workers and people don't have the necessary skills to do it. In terms of demography, it's difficult. Demography is an exogenous variable. Obviously, it's data. We can deal with demographic trends, but we could try to look at technologies that augment rather than replace people. This is a discussion that's going on in the literature about what kind of AI is everything. Is all the technology related to automating or replacing work? It seems not. So we should take a look at those technologies that are complementary with people and try to focus on those ones. Again, macroeconomics is vital because affording a crisis in a country where you have such large numbers of incoming labor force, it's very, very bad for young people or for people who stayed unemployed. Data on labor demand is key, and satisfied demand for labor. We don't have much data in the Global South about this, and it definitely could help to close the gaps. Again, this needs to go hand in hand with skills, because these people entering the labor force and the labor markets need to access the adequate skills. In terms of skills, we need to consolidate a lifelong learning system. The old education model, as we mentioned before, is becoming obsolete, and we need to provide people with the opportunity of keep learning, because now we need to keep learning at every stage of our lives. As we said, it's not just about improving or updating the curricula and the contents of education, it's about improving quality. And we need to focus on all levels of education. Early childhood is key. That is where soft skills get learned and cabled, and the Global South is behind on that. Education is not mandatory until 5 years old, and that should be addressed. Then basic educations to teach digital skills, and reskilling and transition systems should be consolidated and improved. And again, as we said in technological change, the skills plans need to go hand in hand with technological change. We don't want an overqualified labor force that has not a place to use those skills in, because the conditions for investing in technology sectors are not given. Those policies need to be coordinated. They need to go hand in hand. Labor market institutions. So we need to capitalize technology to improve working standards. As I said, platforms might be an opportunity to start tackling some issues related to informality. And inequality, because we have such a pervasive inequality, structural inequality, we need to design policies that are inclusive by design. We cannot expect to reach every person, every target population for a policy, but we need to be actively identifying and including these groups that are traditionally excluded or marginalized. So those are the implications of the 5 building blocks that we are working on to build our own future work in the Global South narrative. To wrap it up, this is a situation that we found when we started this project. There was a narrative about the future of work, that's the green globe. And fortunately, there was and there is also a lot of research about the future of work in the Global South. It's just that these two do not seem to be integrated so much so far. So that's the objective of our project. It's to make sense, to take stock and try to make sense of all the research that there is around on the Global South and use it to feed the global narrative and try to make it truly global. So this is just the last slide to recap what we saw today. There's the fourth industrial revolution transforming the world of work. There is a global narrative about the future of work, but it lacks context. And we have already identified 5 building blocks from the Global South's own evidence-based future of work narrative. And remember that at the time of repeating history or changing history, we in the Global South need to change history. Okay, that's it from my part. Thanks a lot for your patience and for hearing me out. And I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Megan. It was a fascinating presentation, and the topic is really, really fascinating.